We planned the weekend to be calm and quiet. My wife, who's a cop, and I, a retired sergeant, rented a small cabin deep in the woods. We needed time to get away from everything, to escape the stress of our jobs. The place was far from anyone else, just how we wanted. No neighbors, no phone service, nothing but us and the sound of the forest. The cabin was basic. It had one bedroom, a little kitchen, and a small living room with a wood stove. That first evening was peaceful. The only sounds were the fire popping in the stove and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind outside. My wife was curled up on the couch with a book, and I was staring into the fire, letting the quiet sink in. The first night was uneventful, just the kind of peace we were looking for. But on the second day, something felt off. In the afternoon, I went outside to chop some firewood. The trees around the cabin were thick, and their shadows stretched across the ground as the sun began to dip lower. I'd been chopping for a while when I noticed something strange. Footprints in the dirt behind the cabin. They weren't ours. They were fresh, leading off into the woods. I stood there for a long time, just staring at them, trying to figure out who they could belong to. We hadn't seen anyone since we arrived. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed them for a short distance, but they disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the undergrowth. That evening, we made sure to lock all the doors and windows. I wasn't exactly scared, but those footprints stayed on my mind. My wife didn't say much, but I noticed she kept her gun close. I did the same, keeping my old pistol nearby. Around 2 a.m., I woke up. There was a sound outside, faint but clear. It was like footsteps crunching on dry leaves, but there weren't any leaves near the cabin. I lay still, listening. The noise grew louder, moving closer to the window near the bed. My heart started racing, but I didn't move. My wife stirred, but I gently rested my hand on her arm, trying to keep her still. The sound shifted, now moving to the back of the cabin. I got up quietly and crept to the window, pulling the curtain back just a little to look outside. Nothing, just the darkness and the faint outlines of trees in the moonlight. Then I heard it again, this time at the front door. A soft knock, slow and steady. We didn't answer. We stayed completely still, barely even breathing. Minutes passed. The knocking stopped, and everything went silent. But the feeling that someone was out there watching didn't go away. The night felt like it stretched on forever. Every creak and groan of the cabin made my skin crawl. By morning, we found scratches on the front door. They were deep, deliberate marks like someone or something had been testing the wood. The footprints were back too, circling the cabin this time. Neither of us said a word as we packed up our stuff. We both knew it wasn't safe to stay. As we loaded the car, I glanced toward the trees. Something moved, just for a second, but I saw it, a person standing just inside the shadows. They were dressed in dark clothing, their face hidden. I stared, trying to get a better look, but they stepped back into the trees, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. I pointed it out to my wife, but by the time she looked, they were gone. We left without wasting another second. The narrow dirt road leading out of the woods felt endless. My wife kept looking in the rearview mirror, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Even now, back home, I can't stop thinking about it. I've been through a lot in my time, but this was different. This wasn't random. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing by. They were watching us. They knew what they were doing. Last night, I found scratches on our back door. Same deep, deliberate marks. I didn't tell my wife. I didn't sleep. And now I'm wondering how far they'll follow us and what they're waiting for. I wasn't happy when my boss, Mr. Phelps, asked me to spend the weekend at his family cabin to talk about work ideas. It felt strange, but I didn't want to seem like I wasn't trying hard enough. He called it a team-building trip, even though it was just the two of us. The cabin was a few hours away, deep in the woods. I kept telling myself it would be fine. A chance to impress him and maybe even relax a bit. The cabin was old and far from everything. It sat near a small lake, and the nearest town was a good 30-minute drive. My phone stopped working halfway up the bumpy dirt road. Mr. Phelps seemed totally comfortable as he unpacked groceries and work files. Meanwhile, I was looking around the place. It smelled like wet wood, and the walls made noises whenever I moved. I had this weird feeling like someone was watching me, but I figured it was just because I wasn't used to being out here. That first night, we worked on some reports. The cabin was freezing, even with the fireplace going. Around midnight, Mr. Phelps said he was going to bed, leaving me alone in the dim living room. I stayed up a little longer to go over some papers. It was so quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel small. The only sounds were tree branches tapping against the windows once in a while. As I sat there, I thought I heard something outside. It was faint, like someone walking on gravel. I stopped what I was doing and listened. The sound disappeared. I told myself it was probably just an animal and tried to focus on my work. But a few minutes later, I heard it again, this time closer. I got up and looked out the window, but it was pitch black. Couldn't see a thing. The next morning, I mentioned it to Mr. Phelps, but he just laughed and said the woods were full of animals. We spent the day working and fishing at the lake. I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. That night, before bed, I made sure every door and window was locked. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of floorboards creaking. At first, I thought it was Mr. Phelps, but then I heard it again. The steps were slow and heavy, nothing like his. My chest tightened as I grabbed my phone, only to remember there was no service. The footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. I stayed completely still, staring at the gap under the door. A shadow moved, and I could hear quiet breathing. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking. I grabbed a lamp from the nightstand, holding it like a weapon. The door creaked open slowly, and I swung as hard as I could. I hit nothing but air. The hallway was empty, but Mr. Phelps' bedroom door was wide open. I called his name, but no one answered. I stepped into his room, and my stomach dropped. His bed was empty, the covers neatly pulled back like he'd never gone to sleep. His bag and car keys were gone too. I searched the entire cabin, but there was no sign of him. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the lamp and jumping at every little sound. When the sun came up, I grabbed my stuff and started walking down the road, not caring about anything except getting out of there. I finally made it to a small town and called the police. They searched the cabin and the woods around it, but they didn't find Mr. Phelps or any sign of what happened to him. His car was still there, and all the doors were locked from the inside. Weeks passed, and nothing came from the investigation. I quit my job not long after. Every time I think about that night, I feel sick. I don't know if Mr. Phelps planned something strange, or if we crossed paths with someone or something out there. The scariest part? Last week, I got a plain envelope in the mail. Inside was a single piece of paper with just 3 words, "See you soon. I haven't slept since." The cabin was old, barely standing on its shaky foundation. My friend Jake convinced me to spend the weekend there. It belonged to his grandmother and was deep in the woods. He said it was quiet and far away from everything with no cell service. That last part sounded terrible, but I agreed to go anyway. When we got there, the place looked abandoned. The wooden steps groaned loudly when we walked on them. The windows were covered in dirt, and the air smelled damp and musty. Inside, most of the furniture was covered with old sheets, and spiderwebs hung in every corner. There was a fireplace, but the ashes inside looked like they had been sitting there for years. felt like stepping back in time, and not in a good way. Jake started cleaning up while I looked around. The kitchen was a mess. Rusty pots and pans hung on the walls, and the cupboards were full of canned food so old the labels were faded. At first, I thought it was funny, like finding something out of an old movie, but the longer I stayed in the cabin, the less I liked it. It didn't feel right. That night, we lit a fire in the fireplace and sat in the dim light. The forest outside was pitch black, and every sound made me nervous. Branches snapped, and bushes rustled like something, or someone, was moving around out there. Jake said it was just animals, probably raccoons or deer, but it felt too close, too purposeful. The next morning, Jake said we should check out an old shed nearby. His grandmother used to keep tools there, he said. It wasn't far, just a short walk through the trees. When we found it, the shed was even worse than the cabin. The door was falling off, and inside was a mess of broken tools and rotting wood. That's when we saw them. Footprints. Fresh ones in the dirt floor of the shed. At first, Jake laughed and said maybe an animal had wandered in, but these weren't animal tracks. They were human, bare feet. The prints led out of the shed and into the woods. We followed them, even though something in my gut told me we shouldn't. The prints went on for a while but vanished near a small stream. The whole time, I felt like someone was watching us. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. When we got back to the cabin, the front door was open. We had locked it before we left. Nothing inside seemed moved, but the air felt heavier, like the walls were closing in. Jake tried to act calm, but I could see in his face that he was scared too. That night, the noises outside were louder. Heavy footsteps, not the light steps of animals. They moved around the cabin, pausing by the windows. I sat on the couch, frozen, clutching a flashlight. Jake was by the fireplace, staring at the door. Just after midnight, the noises stopped. At first, it was a relief, but the silence that followed was worse. It was so quiet that even the creak of the wood under my feet sounded deafening. Couldn't sleep. Every second dragged on, and I kept waiting for something to happen. When the sun finally came up, we grabbed our things and got out of there. We didn't talk as we packed, and we didn't look back when we left. Outside, we saw them again. Footprints, barefoot just like the ones in the shed. They circled the cabin, stopped by each window, and disappeared into the woods. Weeks later, Jake called me. He said he had asked his grandmother about the cabin. She told him nobody had lived anywhere near it for years.
No neighbors.
No hikers passing through. There was no one who should have been out there. I still think about those footprints. Someone was there. They knew we were inside, and they wanted us to know they had been watching us. And the worst part? The way the footprints circled the cabin. It was like they were looking for a way in. I needed a quiet place to work on my research. The university lab was too noisy, and I was running out of time to finish my project. I studied bugs that live off other creatures, tiny ones that survive in harsh conditions. I found a cabin deep in the woods, far away from everything. It seemed perfect, quiet, alone, and in the middle of nature where I could find all the bugs I needed. The cabin was small, just one bedroom, a little kitchen, and a desk by the window. The forest outside was thick, with trees so close together that sunlight barely got through. The air was full of buzzing and chirping, the sounds of bugs and birds. Felt perfect for what I needed. On my first day, I set up my traps and tools. By evening, I already had a jar full of bugs. Ticks, beetles, and some weird little worm-like things I couldn't name right away. By the second night, I noticed something strange. The traps close to the cabin were overflowing, but the ones further away were completely empty. It was like all the bugs were staying near me, I thought it was just a weird coincidence and went back to work. On the third morning, I woke up with a red, itchy rash all over my arms. It burned, and the itch was so bad I wanted to claw at my skin. I figured it was from handling the bugs, even though I hadn't been bitten. I put on some cream and tried not to think about it. That night, I heard scratching sounds coming from inside the walls. At first, I thought it might be mice, but it didn't sound right. It wasn't random like mice scurrying. It was steady, like something was trying to get in. I checked the walls and even went outside to look around but didn't find anything. When I came back in, the sound stopped. By the fourth day, the rash had spread to my chest and neck. I felt weak and dizzy, like I had a fever. I decided to stop collecting bugs for the day and just study the ones I'd already caught. When I looked at the weird worms under the microscope, I noticed they had tiny hooks all over their bodies, the kind of thing that lets them dig into skin. They didn't look like any bugs I'd ever seen before. While I was studying them, a sharp pain shot through my arm. I looked down and saw one of the worms crawling on my skin. I smashed it, but I couldn't figure out how it got out of the sealed jars. The pain didn't stop, though. It felt like something was moving under my skin. I told myself I was just imagining it and went to bed early, completely worn out. The next morning, I woke up drenched in sweat. The rash had turned into small, swollen blisters. Worse, I could feel something crawling inside my arms. My heart raced as I grabbed some tweezers and carefully opened one of the blisters. A tiny worm wriggled out, alive and squirming. My stomach turned, and my hands shook. That's when I realized the worms weren't just in the jars. They were inside me. I freaked out. I packed my things, ready to leave as fast as I could. But when I opened the door, I froze. The ground outside wasn't still. It was moving. Thousands of bugs were crawling toward the cabin, covering the ground like a living carpet. They were all heading for me. I slammed the door and pushed furniture against it. The scratching started again, louder this time, coming from every wall. I sat in the corner, clutching a can of bug spray, feeling the worms writhing under my skin. The scratching stopped sometime in the middle of the night, but I couldn't bring myself to look outside. The silence felt wrong, heavy. I didn't sleep at all. At first light, I made a run for my car. The bugs were gone, but the forest felt empty, like it was holding its breath. I didn't trust it. I sped to the nearest hospital, and the doctors pulled dozens of worms out of my arms, chest, and back. They said they'd never seen anything like it. Weeks later, back in the city, I tried to tell people what happened. No one believed me. The samples I brought were brushed off as ordinary parasites. They said I must have imagined the rest, maybe from stress or exhaustion. But I know what I saw. Sometimes at night, I still feel them crawling under my skin. The doctors said they got them all out, but I'm not so sure. And every now and then, I wake up to a faint scratching sound, like something trying to get in, or worse, trying to get out. I've never been fond of the idea of staying at that cabin. It wasn't even ours. It belonged to one of my dad's friends, a cop who had a way of making everyone feel uneasy. He wasn't the friendliest guy, but Dad thought it'd be a good chance for me to clear my head for the weekend. I didn't really have a choice. So, I packed up my things and drove out to this old cabin, way out in the woods, with barely any signs of life around. When I got there, the cabin looked old and run down, but it was still standing. The wooden floor creaked under my feet, and the whole place smelled dusty, like it hadn't been touched in years. The nearest neighbor was miles away, so the place felt pretty isolated. To top it off, there was no cell signal. I tried not to think about it too much. It was just a couple of days. I could handle it. The first day went by fine. I kept busy with chopping wood, reading an old book I found in the cabin, and cooking whatever I could manage. But when the sun went down, the forest around me turned pitch black. There were no streetlights, no other houses in sight. The darkness felt suffocating, like the cabin was the only thing left in the world. That night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, almost like a light tapping, coming from outside. I thought it was probably just an animal, but the tapping didn't stop. It was too controlled, too deliberate. My heart started racing. I stayed still in bed, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but the sound kept going. It started to move around the cabin, tapping on the walls, the windows, even the door. I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and tiptoed to the window, trying to see what was out there. I shone the light outside, but there was nothing, just the porch empty. The tapping had stopped, and I felt a momentary sense of relief. But as I lay back down, I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked outside, looking for any signs of what might have caused the noise. No animal tracks, no broken branches, no scratches on the walls, nothing at all. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling stuck with me all day. That night, it happened again. This time, it wasn't tapping, it was louder. The sound was like someone was banging on the walls, the windows, pounding at the door. I stayed in bed, paralyzed, listening as the noise circled the cabin again. Then suddenly it stopped. Not a single sound. I thought it might have gone away, but then I heard a creak on the porch. It sounded like someone was standing there. I could hear the doorknob turning, slowly, as if they were trying to get in. I grabbed the closest thing I could find for protection, a fire poker from the fireplace. My hands were shaking so bad, I could barely hold on to it. I stood there in the dark, not daring to move or make a sound, hoping whatever was out there would just leave. For what felt like hours, there was nothing. Then, finally, the sound stopped. I waited until the first light of morning to leave. When I opened the door to head out, I stopped dead in my tracks. Something was hanging on the porch, just a piece of fabric, tied to the railing. It was part of a police uniform. My stomach dropped. The man my dad had borrowed the cabin from was a cop. I didn't stick around. I rushed back to my car and sped down the dirt road. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. Later, I asked my dad if his friend had been up to the cabin recently or if he'd been anywhere nearby. Dad gave me a strange look, like I was overreacting, and told me his friend had been missing for weeks. I didn't mention anything about the tapping, the pounding, or the piece of fabric. But now, I can't stop thinking about it. What if his friend was never really missing? What if he had been up there all along? And what if it wasn't him who came to visit me in the night? What if there was someone else out there, wearing his uniform, pretending to be him? The thought makes my skin crawl. I'm not sure I'll ever know the full story, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched in that cabin. It's a feeling I can still sense, even now. I sometimes wonder if the same thing happens to anyone else who stays there. I wouldn't be surprised if they never make it out. It was a cold, rainy night when I pulled up to the cabin. The kind of rain that doesn't stop, just falls and falls, hitting the roof over and over, like tiny drum beats. I'd been driving for what felt like forever, and the weather only seemed to get worse as I went further. I just wanted some peace, to be alone for the weekend. Just me, the cabin, and the storm outside. The cabin was small, hidden away in the woods, not far from a lake. This wasn't my first time here, but each time I came, it felt more isolated. Tonight was no different. After I unloaded my things, I settled in by the fireplace, watching the flames flicker and crackle. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, making everything feel quieter. It was the kind of night that makes you feel like you're the last person left in the world. As the hours passed, the rain picked up, pouring harder and harder. I tried to distract myself with the radio, but all I got was static and crackling. That's when I heard it. A knock. It was quiet but clear. My body froze. The knock came from the back door. I couldn't remember if I had locked it when I came in. It was an old door with a simple latch. For a moment, I told myself it was probably the wind, but then the knock came again. Clear, like someone was standing right outside. A cold feeling washed over me. There was no one for miles around. My heart started to race as I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and made my way to the back of the cabin. The rain hammered against the windows, and the darkness outside felt deeper than usual. I stood by the door, flashlight shaking in my hand. My breathing was loud in my ears, and all I could hear was the pounding rain and my heart thumping in my chest. Slowly, I reached for the door handle. Every part of me screamed not to open it, but I did. Nothing. No one was there. I looked around the yard, but all I saw was mud and rain pooling on the ground. I checked the porch and the windows. Still nothing. It didn't make sense. I locked the door again and stood there for a few minutes, trying to shake off the feeling in my stomach. Maybe I was just imagining things, I thought, but then I heard it again. A noise soft but clear. Footsteps, crunching on the wet leaves, right outside the window. I moved quickly to the side of the cabin, keeping low. I peered through the window, breathing fogging up the glass. The darkness outside was thick, but I could still see enough to know there was no one there. Nothing moved, but I had the feeling that something was wrong. My hands were sweating as I grabbed my keys and phone. I wasn't sure what I was doing, but I couldn't think straight. Then I heard it. The door behind me creaked open, slow and heavy. I whipped around. The air was thick, and I felt like something was closing in on me. That's when I saw it. Something dark moving just beyond the trees. It wasn't an animal or the wind. It was a person, a figure, not big, but clear enough to see in the dark. They were walking slowly toward the cabin. I didn't wait. I ran. I bolted, slipping in the mud, not caring about anything except getting to my car. The rain was deafening, and the wind pushed against me, but I didn't dare look back. When I reached the car, I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights flickered on, lighting up the cabin for a second. I could see the dark outline of the place behind me. I didn't know who or what it was, but I wasn't staying to find out. I sped down the road, the rain so heavy I could barely see. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that someone was watching me from the darkness. I tried to calm myself as I hit the main road, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands gripping the wheel tight. But just as I turned a corner, I looked in the rearview mirror, and that's when my blood ran cold. The lights in the cabin were on, the same lights I had turned off before I left. I don't know who or what had been out there that night, but I know one thing for sure. Whoever or whatever was walking outside that cabin wasn't just someone lost in the storm. And I'll never forget that feeling, the one that makes my skin crawl when I hear rain tapping against windows. As I drove away, the only thing I could think of was how those lights had been off when I left, and how I hadn't seen a single car around. I wasn't the only one out there that night, and whoever was left behind wasn't planning on letting me go. I've been stationed at this cabin near the southern border for a couple of weeks now. It's a small, run-down place, far from anything, surrounded by thick bushes and barely used dirt roads. My job's simple. Keep an eye on the area, make sure no one's crossing the border illegally, and report anything strange. The silence out here is something you get used to, but it never feels right. The first few days were just normal. I spent my time scanning the land with binoculars, checking cars that passed by, and doing routine patrols. Then, on the fourth night, something changed. Around 2 a.m., I heard a sound. At first, it was a faint scraping or tapping coming from the back of the cabin. I figured it was just an animal, maybe a coyote or a raccoon, but the sound didn't stop. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The darkness felt thicker than usual, and I shone the light across the gravel and the bushes behind the cabin. Nothing moved. I stood still, listening. The noise came again, louder this time. It sounded like someone was dragging something heavy across the ground. My heart started to race. I moved closer, trying to stay quiet, and kept my flashlight on the area where the sound was coming from. The dirt crunched under my boots. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. The air felt thick, like something was out there, just out of sight. I checked the area around the cabin, making sure my rifle was within reach. The noise stopped as suddenly as it started, but the air still felt heavy. It was like something was watching me, just waiting in the dark. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't an animal. I stayed up the rest of the night, scanning the shadows, trying to see if anything was moving. But nothing came. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone being there. Just dirt and leaves like usual. But the feeling stuck with me. Whoever or whatever was out there was either good at staying hidden, or there was something more to it that I didn't understand. Days passed, and the sound came back every night. It would always start around 2 a.m., and it would go on for hours. I never saw anyone, though. No tracks, no signs that anyone was out there. Just that horrible scraping sound. On the seventh night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my rifle and left the cabin early, determined to find out what was causing the noise. The wind was cold, and the night felt even darker than usual. The scraping started again, and this time I wasn't just going to wait for it to stop. I moved toward the sound, careful not to make any noise, my heart pounding harder as I got closer. The sound seemed to get louder, like it was following me. I pushed through the brush, shining my flashlight in front of me. That's when I saw something in the distance. An old, beat-up truck parked just outside the border. The truck had been there for a while, hidden in the bushes. Someone had been using it to smuggle things across the border. The scraping noise? It was the truck's tires, rubbing against the uneven ground as it shifted slightly. I moved closer, rifle still in hand, and that's when I saw what was in the truck bed, empty barrels. That's when I realized what was going on. They weren't just trying to cross the border. They were smuggling something. I couldn't see what was in the barrels, but I knew it wasn't good. The noise I'd been hearing? It wasn't dragging. It was just the truck moving, shifting as the load inside it settled. I stood there for a while, unsure of what to do. I could have called in the authorities, but it was clear that the truck was waiting to be used again. I was miles from any backup, deep in the middle of nowhere. I made the decision to stay hidden and watch, hoping to get a better idea of what was going on. When the driver returned, I followed him at a safe distance, careful to stay out of sight. He never noticed me, and by the time the first light of dawn was breaking, I knew I couldn't let this slide. I called the local authorities, giving them all the information I had. They arrived shortly after, and the truck was intercepted before it could cross into a more populated area. The whole situation felt unreal. I'd spent days listening to strange sounds, seeing nothing, and then it all clicked. The noise wasn't some ghost or weird animal. It was just people trying to keep their illegal operation hidden. By the time everything was wrapped up, I felt a little relief, but it didn't last. The operation was over, but something still didn't sit right with me. What happened out there wasn't some ghost story or folklore. It was real and a lot more dangerous. The quiet that followed the operation was different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was like the calm before a storm, the kind of silence that makes you wonder if something's still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to make a move. I can't shake the feeling that whoever was behind that truck will come back. Maybe not in the same way, but they'll be back. And the next time, they won't be so easy to stop. I thought I had it all figured out, but now, I'm not so sure. The border may be quiet for now, but I'm left wondering if I'll ever truly feel safe out here again. Something feels off, like it's not over yet. I keep thinking about it every night, hearing that scraping sound in my head, even when there's nothing around. It won't leave me, and I don't think it ever will.